Good afternoon, Suidlanders. How are you? We trust that you're well. This is our second attempt at doing a week in review. Today being Friday the 14th of October, we're going to take a brief, succinct look back on the events of this past week. And I think that we're going to begin with quite a nice sort of anecdote. That's Farmers Weekly. They have a story on farm security, hence the, what is that? I think that's a Rottweiler. But the thing that's relevant to us is that the Farmers Weekly of Friday the 14th of October has an article at the top that reads, "Inflation, why South Africans should worry about the US Federal Reserve Bank." Now, I'm not going to go into great detail, but let it suffice to say that there is a full two-page article describing the connection between the world and the United States Federal Reserve Bank, which by now you should all know is not federal. It is not owned by the state, the Republic of the USA. It's not really a reserve, and it's not a bank, but somehow it is a system. It's 12 banks owned by 8 families, 4 of which are American families, and 4 of which are not. They are European families. There's a lot to say on this subject. It's a huge subject with a lot of interconnected, fascinating information, which begins with the dishonest creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913 under a certain pretext. I beg your pardon, sorry about that, under a certain pretext. In other words, if we have a Federal Reserve Bank owned by these banking families over in Europe, then we won't have X, Y, and Z problems. And lo and behold, when the very first obstacle of that sort cropped up, the Federal Reserve failed. And it has been a klug, a con, if you like, a con job ever since then. So, fascinating article. Get your copy of the Farmers Weekly. The second item is the ongoing shenanigans in the Bank of England and the bond markets. I've given previously quite a simplified explanation of this. I'll try to do it once more. Very simply, pension funds hold sovereign bonds. They hold all sorts of bonds, but bonds are mostly loans obtained by the state. So if a government needs 100 million rand to build a bridge and it doesn't have the money, but it feels it really has to build the bridge urgently, people are protesting, got to get this bridge going, a government may issue a bond. So they'll say we've got 1,000 bonds at 1,000 rand each. Well, that maths doesn't work. But 100 million rands worth of bonds, you can buy them and we will give you a return over, it can be as short as 2 years, to 5 years, to 10 years, to 30 years. And pension funds hold them because they're meant to be very, very stable, reliable, dependable. They don't give you a great return, but you are guaranteed supposedly not to lose money. Recently, the world's biggest company and arguably the world's most evil company, BlackRock, took advantage of an opportunity in the US, in the UK bond market, and in so doing, it exposed 7 of the UK's biggest pension funds to immediate insolvency. In other words, by pulling a move in the bond market, it did affect the values of the bonds that the pension funds were holding. Imagine you're holding an apple. Great, I've got a snack for today. Apples do me well, fill my tummy, keep me going, an apple a day. And then you discover, after holding it for an hour, that there's a worm in it. And that's kind of what happened. The pension funds have been sitting on these bonds that they've been holding forever. What BlackRock did, devalued the bonds, meaning that the assets of the pension funds would have been lower than their liabilities, much affected. Now, the ongoing part of that is that the Bank of England has said, hey, don't worry, we'll take care of it. We will buy bonds, £5 billion worth of bonds a day. We'll print money, in fact, not even print money. We will just add it on a computer screen. We will pretend that we've printed it. We will pretend that it exists. We'll just add a zero. And we'll use that money to buy bonds from the pension funds, thereby reducing their risk of holding assets that are toxic, and thereby increasing demand for bonds in the free market. Other people will be willing to pay more. I'm sorry about that, guys. I think you might have heard that one of my puppies went berserk outside, and I don't have enough time to record this video twice, so I'll pause and I'm going to carry on. So thereby increasing the value in the free market, because that's what happens, and the bonds that we haven't bought from you will increase in value, and therefore the value of your assets will be what it should be. Assets versus liabilities. But what has happened is that the pension funds have not been selling those bonds. They're effectively between a rock and a hard place. They're in a great deal of trouble. There's huge threat. There's threat of imminent, fantastic failure. But there's also the threat, and this seems to be to them the greater threat, or the imperative threat, that if they sell the bonds, the bond price really might recover, and they will have to buy them back at a higher price, thereby losing. So nothing is being repaired. It's an absolute disaster, and it's a big thing. Many people are reporting that this is the end for the British economy, and I'm not talking about eccentric people, right-wingers, conservatives, or people who fancy themselves as prophets and what have you. I'm talking about the mainstream. The mainstream guys are saying, hey, this could be the end. We saw the world's first drone dogfight footage in the Ukraine. Russian and Ukrainian drone, two of them, one from each side, fighting with one another. It wasn't that spectacular. It's nothing like watching two fighter jets fight or something like that. But it was interesting to see the world's first drone dogfight footage. And if you're interested in the result, the Russian drone destroyed the Ukrainian drone. But of course, it may not, and is probably not, the first ever drone dogfight. It's just the first recorded one, where one of the drones involved had a camera and attacked the other drone and recorded everything. Central bank digital currencies in days and weeks and months to come. We're going to discuss this very much, everybody, because they are of greatest significance. Central bank digital currencies, in other words, where you and I live by the lifeblood, if that's the right word, of digital money. Money that doesn't exist even in the pretense of paper. And where every single transaction, this is important, every single transaction is registered by the government, which is not the case now. If you use your credit card, that information doesn't go to any government anywhere unless they specifically request it. It doesn't go as a matter of course. It's registered between Standard Bank and Absa Bank, and the government gets a gross total at the end of the day, week, month, whatever. There were this many transactions, this value, whatever, but they don't necessarily get to discover that you ate lobster when you were staying at the Holiday Inn in Port Elizabeth in August. lobster with an extra side of Kalamata olives, for instance. But central bank digital currencies are now becoming a big thing. In this very week, India has announced that it too shall have a central bank digital currency. And you may remember that in Donald Trump's TARP package, that was the package of a couple of $1 trillion that was sucked out of thin air to insulate ordinary people against the effects of the coronavirus lockdowns. Written into that was the first legal suggestion in the United States anyway of how to implement CBDCs. We're going to do this thing now. So they used the cover of TARP to smuggle in that concept. Transnet's strike is being reported in very strong terms. There is a genuine threat to the economy of South Africa. We are hearing from agricultural unions that they are struggling to get produce exported, and that at the best of times, even without these strikes, the period of time that it takes for a farmer or a co-op to export fresh agricultural produce is amongst the worst in the world. They talk about 3 days just for it to get out, 72 hours just for it to get out. In other words, it gets picked, it gets sent to the port, and then it mucks around for 3 days before the ship can leave, and then it's another few weeks on the water, or the aeroplane, or whatever the case may be. It gets to the airport, and it sits there for 3 days before it takes off and flies to Harrods of London. That's just one example. People are talking in very, very dark terms about what the Transnet strike is doing to the agricultural sector now, in other words, more than 72 hours at present, and what it is doing to many other sectors. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that it is one of the factors that is leading to a very, very dim future in the short term in South Africa, but we'll talk about that in weeks to come. The Crimea Bridge, the bridge between mainland Russia and eastern Crimea. Crimea is like a kind of a giant island off the south of traditional Russia in the Black Sea. It was always part of Russia. It was never not part of Russia, except that during communism, Nikita Khrushchev, the guy who came after Stalin, thought it would be a good idea to give Crimea to its neighbor Ukraine, when Ukraine was a constituent republic of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. As a matter of interest to you, what means Soviet? A Soviet is a village council. A village council is a Soviet. So when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics called itself that, they were saying, we're a union of very democratic socialist republics, as democratic as a good old little Russian village council sitting around to discuss some important matter before the harvest season or whatever. So he said, well, we've always had Crimea, it's been part of Russia, but maybe it makes sense for Ukraine to hold it. And so when in 1991 the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine kept Crimea. Of course, we know the story that Vladimir Putin took it back a few years ago. He built a bridge between Crimea and mainland Russia. The bridge was blown up on Tuesday, and it now comes out that it was the work of MI6. MI6, Military Intelligence Department number 6. I don't remember all of the departments, and I believe that some of them no longer exist. I couldn't tell you. But MI5, Military Intelligence number 5, is domestic intelligence in the UK. Something like the FBI, roughly. And MI6 is the equivalent of the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, which by law is meant only to operate. It is forbidden by law to operate within the borders of the United States of America. Such work must be handled by the FBI, CIA only externally in theory. So MI6, the foreign intelligence department of the United Kingdom, it seems, is very much responsible for the blowing up of the bridge. And naturally, Vladimir Putin has retaliated. He didn't tolerate any of that. What has he done? He has shot something like 300 missiles. 300 missiles. 200 in the first day or 36 hours. It's a bit vague. We're following it very closely, but the information is not precise. Of course, we don't have a red telephone to Vladimir Putin's, the head of the military head, a minister of defense is the word I was looking for, who is Sergei Shoigu, the head of the armed forces of Russia, actually, technically. So we don't know the exact numbers, but in the first day, roughly the first day, 200 missiles, and then another 100 or more in the next, in the intervening 2 days. So there's been huge drama there. The Ukraine has lost over 30% of all its electrical facilities. All sorts of command and control centers have been nailed by these hypersonic and non-hypersonic missiles and suicide drones and related things. To get back to finance, everybody, Bank of America told us this week that over $46 trillion has been wiped off global stock and bond markets just in the past months, to the 9 months to the end of September. We are seeing a crisis the likes of which the world has seldom seen unfold before our very eyes, and that is one of the symptoms of it. They then went on to say that the United States of America will lose, there will be a reduction in the number of jobs, lose 175,000 jobs. I beg your pardon, I shouldn't have left this phone on. 175,000 jobs per month from now on for the foreseeable future. Well, as if that wasn't enough, the head of JP Morgan Chase, the largest of the US commercial and retail banks, a man by the name of Jamie Dimon, who has in recent months repeatedly predicted firstly a storm, then a hurricane smacking the US economy, said that the US will now enter a painful recession. He then went on to say that he expected a further 45% crash in the US stock markets. And many people are saying that based upon his logic and reasoning, it can be expected to be even worse. In other words, he's trying his damnedest to be a good banker and say all of the right things and not preach doom and gloom. But by his own logic, it has to be more severe than he is admitting. And what he's admitting is severe enough. Now, not to get into vaccine politics, this is just a report on a very interesting thing. A former member of parliament, as I understand the terminology used by the French, a member of the French parliament or the French Senate, in any case, an elected member of the French government by the name of Jean Lassalle. Jean Lassalle came out on Monday, the 10th of October, with an absolute bomb, as they're describing it in French. Je me suis fait vacciner. I got vaccinated because I didn't want to leave the feeling, that is to say, among other people, that I was not doing my job as a deputy, an elected deputy of France. But I didn't know that Emmanuel Macron was not vaccinated, and neither were most of the members of the government. Most of the members of the French government? And I did not know that a significant number of my colleagues were not vaccinated either. In other words, at parliamentary level. And when I said that I fell sick after the vaccination, nobody listened to me and they wanted to silence me. So this is a huge scandal. Whether you're pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, it doesn't matter. The point is not whether one should or shouldn't get vaccinated. Nobody's talking about what. The point is that the people who said get vaccinated didn't take the vaccines. Very interesting. Silver, our second to last item for tonight. Big movements in silver in the world. The London Bullion Metals Association, the largest holder of physical bullion, that is to say metals used as instruments of wealth, such as silver and gold. In fact, really silver and gold, we don't use copper for such purposes anymore, although we may in the future. And although platinum and palladium have high values, you don't get not really platinum coins for trading purposes, as a sort of a form of money. So bullion metals really in practice comes down to silver and gold. London Bullion Metals Association, the largest holder in the world, is almost run out. Why? Because people are frantically buying silver all over the world in a desperate attempt to insulate themselves from what now promises to be a spectacular crisis in terms of money, in terms of finance, economics, and trade over the next 15 months at least. The same is happening at the Commercial Metals Exchange in New York, the second biggest after the LBMA. They're running out of silver. They've had to bring in silver from London, not recently, but some time ago. They very famously chartered jumbo jets to fly silver into New York to the COMEX in a desperate attempt not to, be completely sold out and create absolute panic in the markets. But that hasn't worked. It's continuing that way. Those of you who follow the silver price may be thinking, but then why has the silver price been going down? That is because of spoof trades, and that is why the JP Morgan and the Morgan Stanley people were taken to court, and why they were successfully prosecuted. The price of silver and gold has been manipulated. We know it has been manipulated. It is not a Saitlander's conspiracy theory to say that it has been manipulated. The demand for it and the price of it are nowhere near, matching up. Besides which, the price that you're following is not the price for an ounce of silver. If you see it's $25, $28, $27, $29, $30. What you're watching is the future spot price, which is like a bet for a given day, on paper silver. And what paper silver is somebody might buy, let's say, 100 ounces of silver and say, I'm going to trade in silver, but I'm doing it the paper way. If you buy silver, I'll give you a certificate for it. And if in a year's time you come to redeem your certificate, if the price in paper silver, it's known as SLV, has gone up, well, you're going to score. Come on, do business with me, man. It's the latest thing. But they create about 20 pieces of paper for every piece of physical silver. So it's just a nonsense. It's just an absolute fiction, which is an expression of Reserve Bank, privately owned Reserve Bank fiat currency. It might be a bit much for some of you, but we'll get into it in weeks and months to come, and you'll understand some more. But basically, it's nonsense. It's absolute fiction. And people are getting rid of their SLVs, their certificates for paper silver, based on a future spot price. They don't want them anymore. They're selling them like mad, and nobody wants to buy them. But what people do want to buy is physical silver, physical silver, physical silver. The markets are going crazy like never before. And last but not least, United States debt. The debt in the United States of America has now officially reached $31 trillion, ladies and gentlemen. And this is in an economy with a GDP of only $23 trillion. Now, debt and GDP are not They are not necessarily correlated. But historically, to have a debt that was greater than your GDP was just unfathomable, even if they weren't necessarily dependent upon one another. Now, the US has made a mockery of money, money as money, currency as currency, and debt as debt, and GDP as GDP, by printing amounts of money that people couldn't imagine. And interestingly, it has increased by 35% over the past 3 years. Don't blame Joe Biden. Don't forget that Joe Biden only assumed power on January the 6th, 2021. We're in 2022. And the TARP Acts under Donald Trump occurred in 2020. So Donald Trump is very largely responsible for that. We can get into the figures in another day. And that's it for the week, everybody. We've got ongoing shenanigans, really big shenanigans in the Bank of England. The world's first drone dogfight recorded. CBDCs popping up left, right, and center all over the world, destroying the dollar and posing enormous threats to our safety, to our security. We've got the Transnet strike doing a great deal of real, actual harm to South Africa. We've got the UK's MI6 blowing up the Kerch Bridge, or the Crimea Russia Bridge, and Putin's retaliation, bombarding Ukraine with between 300 and 400 hypersonic and non-hypersonic missiles in recent days. And then we've got all of the Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase stuff. We've got the French government scandal. It being revealed that Macron, the government, the French deputies in the parliament and the Senate, they didn't take the vaccine. And silver, people are going crazy for it. And last but not least, the US debt of $31 trillion. Unbelievable. Anyway, guys, thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Cheerio. Goodbye.